The first time humans ever put a stylus to wet clay, they weren't writing stories. They were writing lists, grain counts, temple inventories, who owed what to whom. Boring stuff, honestly. But buried inside some of the oldest lists we've ever found is something that shouldn't be there. A memory of a time before the list makers existed, before their cities, before their kings, before, according to their own records, the world as they knew it even began. Think about that for a second. The very first writers on Earth, the people who invented the concept of recorded history, are telling us there was something before them. Someone before them, a civilization, or at least people living and building and ruling long before anyone thought to scratch a symbol into clay or carve one into stone. And here's the unsettling part. We've dug through deserts, drained swamps, mapped ocean floors with sonar, and cross-referenced every ancient text we can get our hands on. We still haven't found what they were talking about. Over the next while, we're going to trace this thread all the way back. We'll look at the Sumerian King List and its impossible reigns stretching back before any flood. We'll look at Egyptian priests describing a first time, a golden age ruled by gods before a single pharaoh sat on a throne. We'll look at what the Greeks inherited, and possibly distorted, from older cultures who came before them. And we're going to test every single one of these claims against what archaeology can actually prove, because there's a difference between a good story and a real civilization, and figuring out that difference is exactly why you're here. Before we go further, if you're listening to this late at night or maybe on a long drive, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is right there. I love seeing this. Last week someone wrote in from Lagos at 2 a.m, someone else from Vancouver during their lunch break, all listening to the same story about people who lived nearly 1 million years before either of them existed. It's a strange kind of connection, and I genuinely enjoy seeing it stack up in the comments. Also, if you want this without any ads interrupting, and without music underneath, I put these episodes on Spotify completely clean. Just the voice, just the story. Following me there helps more than you'd think, and if you leave a 5-star review anywhere you're listening, it genuinely helps other curious people find this stuff. That's the only ask, promise. Now, before we chase any ghosts, we need rules. What actually counts as a written record versus a myth retold generations later? What counts as a civilization instead of just a scattered tribe? And what does it even mean to say we've never found something? Does that mean no physical trace exists, or just that we haven't recognized it yet? Because here's the uncomfortable possibility we have to sit with. Maybe the evidence is already in our hands. Maybe it's sitting in a museum drawer, mislabeled or underwater, unexplored or worse. Maybe it's gone completely, erased by 10,000 years of rivers, ice and rising seas. Let's find out what the oldest writers on Earth were actually trying to tell us. Let's actually define our terms, because civilization gets thrown around like it means one thing, and it really doesn't. When archaeologists use the word, they're usually talking about a cluster of specific traits showing up together. Cities meaning permanent settlements dense enough to require organized planning. Writing, or at least record-keeping, sophisticated enough to track debts, harvests and laws. Bureaucracy, some system of people managing resources and labour beyond a single family unit. And trade networks, evidence that goods, materials or ideas were moving across distances too great for one group to cover alone. A complex society can have some of these traits without all of them. A civilization, in the strict sense, tends to have most or all of them working together. That distinction matters a lot for what we're chasing, because it's entirely possible for something to be complex, organized, even impressive, without ever leaving the kind of evidence we'd recognize as a civilization in the textbook sense. So now the real question: How does an entire civilization just disappear? Not fade from memory, not get renamed, but vanish so completely that modern archaeology with satellites, ground-penetrating radar and DNA analysis still can't find it. There are actually several very ordinary, very unmysterious ways this happens. Sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age, somewhere around 120 meters in places, which means entire coastlines, the exact zones where early human settlements would have clustered, because coasts mean fish, trade, and mild climate, are now sitting underwater. Rivers shift course over centuries, sometimes burying old settlements under meters of silt, sometimes just leaving them stranded in the desert, miles from the water they depended on. Erosion grinds mud brick walls back into the dirt they came from within a few generations if nobody's maintaining them. And later civilizations, when they build their own cities, tend to build right on top of the old ones, quarrying stone from abandoned structures, flattening old foundations, erasing the layer below without even realizing what they're destroying. Then there's the preservation problem, and this one's sneaky. Stone survives, mud brick doesn't. A society that built in fired clay and timber in a wet climate is going to leave almost nothing behind after a few thousand years, while a society that carved in limestone in a bone-dry desert can leave temples standing for 5 millennia. This means our picture of the ancient world is wildly skewed toward whoever happened to build in durable materials in dry, stable environments. Egypt survives partly because Egypt is a desert. Whatever existed in wetter, greener regions during the same period may have been just as advanced, and left almost nothing we can dig up. Add looting, war, and centuries of people literally recycling old stone into new buildings, and you start to understand why we haven't found it. Doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't there. So how do archaeologists find cultures that left no writing at all? This is actually one of the more remarkable tools in the field. Ceramics are almost like fingerprints. Style, technique, and decoration change fast enough that pottery shards alone can date a site and connect it to trade networks hundreds of miles away. DNA pulled from ancient remains can trace migration, population mixing, even diet. Isotope analysis on bones and teeth can tell you where someone grew up versus where they died, revealing movement and trade that no text ever recorded. And settlement patterns, the size, spacing, and layout of structures across a landscape can reveal social organization even when not a single word survives. In other words, silence in writing doesn't mean silence in the archaeological record. There are other ways for the past to talk, which brings us to 3 possibilities we need to keep separate as we go through this, because they get tangled together constantly. First, there's the possibility of a genuinely unknown civilization, something real that existed and simply hasn't been found yet, sitting under sand, silt, or ocean. Second, there's the possibility of misread or mistranslated texts, ancient scribes describing something that actually did happen, but describing it in ways we're interpreting incorrectly thousands of years later. And third, there's the possibility of a mythologized past, real history that got exaggerated, compressed, or symbolically inflated over centuries of retelling until it looks like something far grander than what actually occurred. Here's the standard we're going to hold ourselves to throughout this. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That's a real principle, and it matters. But it's also not proof of anything either. A gap in the record is an invitation to keep looking, not a blank check to believe whatever we want. So as we dig into the Sumerian King List, into Egypt's first time, into Atlantis and the drowned coastlines of the Mediterranean, we're going to ask the same question every single time. Is this a real trace of something lost, or is this us, wanting there to be more than there actually is? When we talk about the first human records, it's tempting to imagine someone sitting down to write a history book, A scribe in a linen kilt, reed pen in hand, looking back over ages and carefully recording the rise and fall of forgotten peoples. That is not what happens. The earliest writing we have in both Mesopotamia and Egypt is shockingly unromantic. It's grain counts, cattle tallies, ration lists, receipts. The oldest cuneiform tablets from Uruk, around 3300–3200 BCE, aren't myths. They're spreadsheets baked in clay. A line that says something like so many measures of barley delivered to so and so on behalf of the temple of such and such, over and over. Columns of numbers, commodity signs, personal names, institutional names. In Egypt, the very earliest writing is similar. Before you get royal boasts carved 50 feet high, you get tags on goods buried in tombs at Abydos. Tiny labels of bone or ivory with signs for oil, cloth, or wine, sometimes with a place name or an official's title. They're literally shipment tags. This jar came from here, belongs to this estate, was inspected by this guy. So why is that where writing starts? Because writing is expensive. Someone has to be trained to do it. Someone has to make the tablets, cut the reeds, mix the ink. In small, early states, that kind of investment only makes sense if it solves a constant, painful problem. And for emerging temple economies in Mesopotamia, or royal estates in Egypt, the problem wasn't how do we remember the distant past? It was where did the grain go, and who owes what to whom? If your livelihood depends on redistributing food and labour from hundreds or thousands of people, memory isn't enough. Oral tradition works well for stories, laws, even genealogies. It's terrible for remembering the exact number of sheep transferred from one flock to another at the end of last year's tax cycle. So the first texts are tools. They're not trying to talk to the future. They're trying to keep today from falling apart. This is why those first human records focus on accounting, offerings, and names rather than history. Names are there because someone needs to be responsible. This worker, that official, this donor, that debtor. Offerings are there because temples are economic hubs. So many loaves and beers to this god, on this festival day, provided by this district. If you showed one of those early scribes our obsession with what's the oldest story, they'd probably be confused. The oldest story to them would be something recited at a festival, or sung in a courtyard at night. Stories lived in voices, in memory, in performance. Clay was for things too boring and too crucial to trust to memory. But then something interesting happens. Over a few centuries in Mesopotamia, the writing system used for barley and sheep starts getting bent to fit more abstract ideas. Signs that once meant only literal objects get used to write syllables and sounds. That unlocks narrative, myths, hymns, letters, legal disputes, even self-conscious history. Egypt does something similar with hieroglyphs. The same signs that label jars and estates start appearing in formulaic royal announcements, then in longer inscriptions about victories and building projects. And the people doing this are not random, they're scribes. Scribal schools grow up attached to temples and palaces. In Mesopotamia, we actually have their homework. Tablets covered in repeated signs, copied phrases, exercise lists of professions and cities and gods. In Egypt, we have school texts where students copy wisdom sayings and classic tales. To become a scribe, you memorize, then you copy again. You inherit not just techniques, but a canon. This is where administration quietly turns into deep time. If you're a scribe in, say, old Babylonian times, 1,000 years after writing was invented, your exercise texts already include older compositions. Lists of cities arranged in meaningful orders, lists of temple offerings that trace customs generations back. Crucially, king lists, sequences of rulers tied to cities and dynasties that claim to go back before any living memory. Those king lists don't start their story with, "I was there." They start with "long ago" in a very literal bureaucratic way. After the kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. That formula doesn't sound like a warehouse inventory anymore. It sounds like cosmogony, like the origin of order itself. But structurally, it's still a list, and lists are powerful. In a scribal context, a list is authority. If something is on the list, it exists. It counts, it belongs. If it's not, it might as well be invisible. So when scribes start arranging rulers, cities, and dynasties into ordered sequences, they're not just remembering. They're defining what counts as the legitimate past. Over time, those lists reach backward beyond any records that were actually written contemporaneously. A king who really did commission inscriptions in 2400 BCE might be remembered accurately. A king said to have reigned for 28,800 years before the flood. That's not based on contemporary receipts, that's a retrospective compilation, later scribes assembling, reconciling, and sometimes inventing to produce a smooth, authoritative line from the beginning to now. And here's the catch. When we, thousands of years later, read, "The first human records mention a civilization older than theirs," we're usually not looking at a day of inscription. We're looking at a document put together long after the fact, by people whose job it was to harmonize messy, local traditions into a single tidy history. Errors sneak in. Agendas sneak in. If a dynasty wants to claim divine sanction, its scribes might lengthen the reigns of its founding kings, or connect them to mythical ancestors. If a city wants to argue it was first, its priests might emphasize temple traditions that place their founding before the flood, before everyone else. Because scribes copy from earlier tablets, those enhancements propagate. A mistake in one king list can spread for centuries as students dutifully reproduce it. A political rewrite can ossify into sacred chronology. By the time we encounter it, it looks ancient and objective, when it may actually be a cleverly edited memory. So when a text from 1800 BCE refers to antediluvian rulers or speaks of cities and sages from unimaginably ancient times, we have to ask, is this a contemporary inscription? Something written during the life of the person it mentions? Or is it a retrospective compilation, part of a long scribal tradition that has already blurred the line between account book and origin myth? That difference matters. Contemporary inscriptions can tell us who paid what, who built what, who conquered whom, in the writer's own lifetime. Retrospective compilations tell us how much later people wanted their world to feel anchored in a vast, orderly, and often exaggerated past. And it's precisely in that shift, from receipts and rosters to curated timelines, that the doorway opens. A doorway through which later readers and modern enthusiasts can walk and say, "Look, even the very first writers remembered someone older than themselves." The question is whether that someone older is a real, unfound civilization, or the product of list makers extending their ledgers into eternity. When people talk about ancient texts that remember a civilization older than themselves, there's one document that almost always gets dragged onto the stage, the Sumerian King List. On the surface, it sounds exactly like the thing we've been building toward, a neat, official-sounding record of who ruled Mesopotamia from the very beginning of time up to the scribes' present day. No myths, no monsters, just names, cities, and numbers. Underneath the surface, it's a tease, because the king list starts in a place we can't really test, then slowly walks forward into history we actually can. The versions we have were written and recopied over centuries, but the composition probably took shape sometime in the late 3rd or early 2nd millennium BCE. Old Babylonian copies from around 1800 BCE are the best known. They're written in cuneiform on clay tablets, in the same script used for contracts, letters, and those endless grain accounts. The King List opens with a formula you hear again and again. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not once upon a time, not in the days of our ancestors. Kingship descends from heaven into a city. Then, matter-of-factly, the list starts counting. Alulim became king. He ruled 28,800 years. Alalga ruled 36,000 years. Already, something is off. These aren't the modest reigns of frail humans. This is cosmic time. The first section of the King List, the one that modern scholars call Antediluvian, before the flood, has 8 or 10 kings depending on the version. Their reigns stretch for tens of thousands of years each. Added together, you get a total span so absurd that even in Antiquity it would have been more symbolic than plausible. Then comes the pivot, then the flood swept over. After that line, the tone shifts. Kingship descends again, this time to Kish, and from there the reign lengths start coming down out of the stratosphere. You still see some impressive numbers by modern standards. Hundreds of years for a few early post-flood kings, but as the list marches toward the later dynasties, reigns shrink into the realm of decades, then single digits. You start recognizing cities that we've actually excavated. You start meeting rulers who turn up in their own inscriptions. So what is this thing really? One way to read it is, at face value, as a literal history of human rule from a time of god-kings who lived for eons, through a world-destroying flood, down to the scribes present. That's essentially how later Mesopotamian traditions treated it, and it's not far from how some modern fringe theories still use it. But there are other, more grounded ways to make sense of it. Those impossible reign lengths for one. They're not random. They're built out of regular numbers that had special meaning in Mesopotamian mathematics and religion, multiples of 60, factors of 3 and 5, carefully structured totals. You can think of them like the round, symbolic numbers that show up in other traditions, the 1,000 generations in some biblical passages, or the cyclical ages of thousands of years in Indian cosmology. They're not diary entries, they're theology baked into arithmetic. The message isn't Alalim literally sat on a throne for 28,800 years without getting bored. It's more like the first kings belonged to a qualitatively different order of time, a sacred era when kingship was still fresh from the gods. There's also the political angle. When the King List was taking shape, Mesopotamia had already seen centuries of city-states vying for dominance, coalitions rising and falling, dynasties overthrowing each other. To claim universal rule in a landscape like that, you don't just need troops. You need a story. The King List provides that story. It doesn't just say, here's a bunch of kings we happen to remember. It says kingship itself is a single legitimate institution that moves from city to city in an orderly line. When it passes to your city, Kish, Uruk, Izin, that's not an accident of warfare. That's fate. That's the way it was meant to go. So those antediluvian kings, with their superhuman reigns, aren't just background flavour. They anchor the whole institution in mythic time. They say, what we're doing now, this dusty, compromised, very human politics, is plugged directly into an original, almost divine pattern. But buried in all that messaging is the kernel that keeps nagging at people. Are these purely invented mythic forebears, or are they distorted memories of real, much older political orders? That question matters because of what happens later in the list. Once you get past the flood, some of the names and cities start lining up with things we can independently verify. The city of Uruk appears, with a king named Gilgamesh. We haven't found his tomb, but the city is real, and the period is archaeologically rich. The list mentions a king of Ur called Ur-Nammu. We have his own inscriptions, his ziggurat, his law code. Other entries, like some rulers of Akkad and Isin, line up broadly with sequences we reconstruct from contemporary economic tablets and royal inscriptions. In other words, the King List is not just fantasy. Parts of it overlap with what we'd call history, other parts clearly do not, and in between the clearly mythical and the clearly historical, there's a foggy zone where reign lengths are exaggerated, dynasties are smoothed over, and local traditions are harmonized into one big, sweeping line. So when the King List talks about kings before the flood, and when it treats that flood as a clean dividing line between two ages, it's tempting to see it as evidence for a literally lost pre-flood civilization that was wiped from the map. But antediluvian in this context doesn't necessarily mean belonging to a completely unknown global culture. It means belonging to a stylized age set apart from ordinary time. It's like saying in the age before our laws, or back when the gods still walked among humans. It signals status in a story, not GPS coordinates on a vanished continent. Could there still be faint political memories encoded in those early names and cities? It's possible. Eridu, the first city in the King List, is also the earliest known urban settlement in southern Mesopotamia archaeologically. That's intriguing. Other antediluvian cities the text mentions, like Shuruppak, have very old occupation layers and evidence of ancient flooding. There are overlaps that make you pause, but the presence of those overlaps doesn't force us into a single conclusion. It could mean that later scribes projected their own sacred geography backward into mythic time. It could mean that oral traditions about very old, very real cities were wrapped in exaggerated numbers and cosmic framing. It does not, by itself, prove that a technically advanced global civilization flourished and then vanished without a trace. What the King List really shows us is how tightly Mesopotamian ideas about time, disaster, and legitimacy were woven together. A primeval era of immense rains, a catastrophic flood that wipes the slate, a reset of kingship in a new city, then a long, ordered sequence down to the present. That flood in the middle is the hinge. It's where myth and memory do their heaviest lifting, and it's the part of the story that doesn't just belong to Sumer. Variants of a great flood, of a world before and a world after, show up in texts from across the Near East and far beyond. So to understand what the King List is really hinting at, we have to follow that water. We have to ask what the flood might have meant to people living on floodplains, watching rivers change course, seeing entire towns erased in a season, and then turning those experiences into the backbone of their prehistory. If you live your whole life on a floodplain, you don't need a global ocean to rise for your world to end. Southern Mesopotamia is basically a pancake made of mud. The Tigris and Euphrates carry huge loads of silt. They meander, they split, they abandon channels and cut new ones. When they flood, they don't just get your feet wet. They move the landscape. A levee breaks upstream, a channel jumps a bank, and in a single season an entire settlement can go from riverfront to buried under 3 meters of sludge. Fields vanish, boundary markers disappear, canals are choked. If your village depends on a particular channel for irrigation, and that channel simply isn't there next year, it feels like the gods pulled the plug on creation. That's the background radiation for Mesopotamian flood stories. The Atrahasis epic, composed in Old Babylonian form around the same time as some versions of the King List, tells of a god-sent flood that will wipe out humanity because people have become too noisy. The god Enki warns Atrahasis, tells him to dismantle his house and build a boat. He loads it with seed and animals, survives the deluge, makes offerings afterward. The gods regret how thorough the destruction was and agree on new ways to control human population without nuking the whole species. The flood episode in the Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in the standard Babylonian version over 1,000 years later, retells essentially the same story with a different hero, Utanapishti. Again, divine counsel, decision to send a flood, secret warning, boat survivors, birds sent out to test the receding waters. These are not careful, day-by-day chronicles of one flood in 1 year. They're mythic frameworks that crystallize a type of experience, the sense that the known world can be suddenly erased by water and that whatever comes after is qualitatively different. And crucially, they're told from the perspective of people who already live in cities, already farm with canals, already think in terms of kingship and temples. They're not saying once there was an earlier global technoculture that vanished. They're saying there was a time before the order we know, and the thing that separates that time from ours is a catastrophe. Archaeology along these rivers shows why that kind of story had staying power. At sites like Shuruppak, modern Thera, archaeologists have found a thick, clean layer of river silt separating one occupation phase from the next, dating to the late 3rd millennium BCE. Above it, new houses, new streets. Below it, older settlement. The flood didn't erase humanity, it interrupted a local chapter. People rebuilt, often on the same spot, sometimes shifting slightly as the water dictated. Similar flood deposits pop up at other cities and villages, but not always at the same time. One town has a dramatic flood layer when its neighbour upriver does not. Another shows signs of more gradual waterlogging and abandonment, rather than a single apocalyptic event. If you zoom out to the regional scale, what you see is not a single once and for all world flood. You see recurrent, sometimes destructive floods with local and regional impacts that, to the people living through them, absolutely could feel like ends and beginnings of ages. Now take that repeated pattern and run it through centuries of oral tradition. Oral storytelling has its own logic. It compresses, simplifies, and sorts events into meaningful shapes. 10 different bad floods over 300 years can be fused into the flood. A vague sense that things were different before my grandfather's grandfather can turn into there was a world before the waters came, and a world after. Time gets flattened. Instead of a messy sequence of minor and major disasters, migrations and rebuildings, you get one big hinge in the story. Before, different rules, different kinds of humans, maybe even different kinds of kings. After, the familiar order, your own institutions, your own gods in their current arrangement. That compression is part of what makes disasters so good at generating prehistories. A big flood carves a clean line in memory. Before, after. Once you have that line, it's easy to start treating before as not just earlier, but other, a separate age, a different dispensation. You don't need to posit a fully distinct civilization with alien technology. You just need a sense that the normal rules didn't yet apply. The stories themselves encourage this. In Atrahasis, the gods renegotiate humanity's place in the cosmos after the flood. In Gilgamesh, Utanapishti is granted a weird, liminal immortality and sent to live at the mouth of the rivers, outside ordinary human space. The flood is the moment when the current human condition is locked in. Meanwhile, the mud keeps lying. When excavators dig in some Mesopotamian tells, they do hit what looks like a sharp break. Flood silt, then nothing for a while, then a different style of architecture. It's tempting to read that as old civilization destroyed, new one appears. Sometimes there really is disruption. Settlements abandoned for generations, political centres shifting up or down river, population moving toward more stable channels. But more often when we get fine-grained data, radiocarbon dates, pottery sequences, continuous occupation levels, we see continuity threaded through the chaos. The same ceramic traditions reappear above the flood layer. The same deity names show up again in later temples. Family seals carry forward iconography that predates the disaster. In other words, catastrophic narratives can grow up around very real, very destructive events, but the people living through them are usually the same broad cultural continuum before and after. The idea of a deep previous world can be a way of giving emotional and theological weight to upheavals without there actually being a lost, unrelated civilization behind the curtain. There's another complication. Stories travel better than sediments. By the time the Gilgamesh epic was circulating, flood motifs were already baked into Mesopotamian literature. Those motifs then spread. Later Hebrew texts in the Hebrew Bible's Genesis tell a flood story with striking parallels to Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, divine decision to destroy, a chosen man, an ark, animals, birds, a sacrifice afterward. Many scholars see direct or indirect borrowing from Mesopotamian models, reshaped for a new religious context. Beyond the Near East, we find flood stories in Greece, India, and farther afield. Some of these may be independent responses to local disasters. Others may be distant echoes of Near Eastern themes carried by migrants and traders. Once a world-destroying flood becomes a standard way to talk about cosmic resets, it can be plugged into many different local histories. That makes it much harder to trace any single text back to one specific inundation. So how do we even start linking a story to an actual event, instead of to a pattern? Historians and archaeologists look for a few things. First, geographic specificity. Does the text mention particular rivers, cities, or regions, or is it floating in mythic nowhere? Atrahasis and Gilgamesh are rooted in the Tigris-Euphrates world. That narrows the search. Second, relative dating. Can we estimate when the story took shape, and does that roughly line up with major flood episodes in the same area? The old Babylonian Atrahasis overlaps in time with some of those late 3rd millennium flood deposits, but that still gives us a window of centuries, not a day and hour. Third, archaeological signatures. Do we see widespread flood layers across many sites at once, followed by consistent patterns of rebuilding or abandonment? Or are we seeing a patchwork of local events, later stitched into one narrative? Fourth, uniqueness. Is there something about a particular flood, its scale, its associated destruction of political centres, its tie-in with a known dynasty collapse, that would plausibly make it stand out in memory compared to all the others? Or is the story more like a composite of every bad flood we ever endured? Even when some of these criteria line up, most specialists remain cautious. At best, we can say that Mesopotamian flood stories probably grew out of repeated experiences with severe riverine floods, in a landscape that made them feel world-ending. We can see how those experiences, told and retold, hardened into a narrative of a single great flood that separates a hazy before from the structured documented after. What we can't do, from the existing evidence, is point to Atrahasis or the King List and say, this definitely encodes the memory of civilization X that existed 10,000 years earlier and vanished overnight. Floods give us boundaries in the story. They give later people a way to imagine a deep, earlier world, but names like Eridu and Sippar, attached to that earlier world in texts, are still anchored in real cities that we can dig. And when we go to those places, the dirt tells a more complicated, more continuous story than the myths would have you believe. When ancient Mesopotamian scribes talk about before the flood, they don't leave that earlier world as a vague nowhere. They hang names on it: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. In the Sumerian King List, those are the antediluvian cities where kingship descended from heaven and moved from one place to another long before any dynasty we can actually document. Later hymns and temple inscriptions echo that same hierarchy. Some cities are just cities, but a few are treated as primordial, as if they were built at the dawn of time. And that's where things get interesting, because several of those places are real, physical sites. We've dug them. We found bricks stamped with royal names, temples, city walls, trash pits. But the way the texts talk about them doesn't always line up neatly with what comes out of the ground. Take Eridu. In Sumerian tradition, Eridu is the first city. The oldest, the place where kingship descended, the home of the god Enki, lord of fresh water and wisdom. Later lists of temples describe its great sanctuary, the Abzu in almost nostalgic tones, as if even in their day it already belonged to a more ancient world. Excavations at Eridu, at a big mound in the southern alluvium, do show impressive antiquity. The site has a deep sequence of temple platforms, one built on top of another, going back into the Ubaid period, before what we usually call Sumerian civilization really coheres. It's one of the earliest known monumental cult centers in southern Mesopotamia. That's a big deal. But if you're looking for a single once and for all first city layer that matches the mythic Eridu of the King List, you don't find it. What you see instead is gradual growth. A small cult focus becomes a larger shrine. Shrines accumulate offerings and rebuildings. Houses cluster nearby. Over centuries, those layers stack up. The firstness of Eridu in the texts maps loosely onto its role as one of the earliest sacred centres, not onto a clear archaeological dividing line where urban life suddenly appears overnight. So is the text wrong? Not exactly. It's doing something different. It's taking a real place with genuinely deep roots and elevating it into a cosmic anchor point. First city here is less a chronological statement and more a theological one, the place where order, kingship, and proper ritual first crystallized out of chaos. Sippar shows a different kind of problem. In later Babylonian tradition, Sippar is another important cult center associated with the sun god Shamash. It appears on the king list as an antediluvian city. We know of a historical Sippar in the Old Babylonian period and later, and we have archaeological remains at sites identified as Sippar and Sippar of the goddess Anunitum. But when scribes in, say, the first millennium BCE copy a list saying kingship was in Sippar before the flood, are they pointing to the same hill we're excavating now? Or has the name roamed place names can be slippery? Rivers shift, canals silt up, political centres move a few kilometres to higher ground, and the old place name gets applied to the new spot. Sometimes an entire settlement shifts while the sacred label stays put. Other times the cult stays put and the name moves with the administration. Over a few thousand years you can end up with one name attached to multiple mounds, or a mound that has worn several different names at different times. That's where the problem of tells comes in. Most Mesopotamian cities in the archaeological record are tells, artificial hills built from thousands of years of mud brick construction, collapse, reuse, and rebuilding. Each new temple is built on the flattened remains of the old one. Each new street level lies a metre above the last. If you walk on top of a big tell today, you're standing on the latest version of that city. To get to the earliest occupations, you have to tunnel down through younger layers. But those younger layers are often the ones with big stone foundations, fired brick, and monumental architecture that can survive. The very first phases at the bottom may be thin surfaces of trampled mud, reed structures, fragile early shrines that are easy to miss or destroy on the way down. So, what would it even mean to not find a city mentioned in a list or myth? It doesn't always mean the place never existed. It might mean we've only dug the upper few metres of a mound, and the earliest levels are still buried or inaccessible under modern villages, irrigation works, or high water tables. The site is eroded, ploughed out, or buried under later canal systems. The name has migrated, and the mound that actually preserves the relevant phase is sitting under a different modern toponym. The text is telescoping multiple real sites into one legendary locus. When scholars try to match a name on a clay tablet to a hill in the landscape, they don't just shrug and guess. They use a whole toolkit. Phonetics. How would that Sumerian or Akkadian name likely have sounded? How could it have shifted over time into later forms recorded in Assyrian, Babylonian, Greek or Arabic sources? Geography. What does the text say about where this city lies in relation to rivers, other cities or regional features? Does that fit known canal systems, trade routes or environmental reconstructions? Later references. Do first millennium scholars, geographers or temple lists associate the same name with a known district or deity cult that we can track archaeologically? Material culture. When we dig candidate sites, does the pottery, architecture and layout match what we'd expect for a city of that name at the time the text is talking about? Do we find inscriptions on bricks or tablets using that toponym? Even with all that, unfound is a moving target. A place that was purely literary in 1920 can suddenly become very real when satellite imagery, new surveys, or a lucky cuneiform tablet tie a name to a mound. A city confidently identified in the mid-20th century can be reassigned when fresh excavations show the pottery sequence is off by centuries. In the Near East, the gap between text and dirt is constantly being renegotiated. So when an early list talks about Eridu or Sippar as antediluvian, older than the world we know, we're not automatically looking at a ghost civilization that left no trace. We're looking at real cities whose earliest chapters are compressed, mythologized, and sometimes displaced in memory. Some layers may still be buried. Some may have melted back into the mud. Some may never be cleanly separable from the normal continuum of settlement that follows. The mystery isn't always that we can't find the place at all. It's that the place we can find refuses to match the story in a simple, satisfying way. Egypt has its own way of doing this time before time move. If Mesopotamian scribes talk about antediluvian cities, Egyptian priests talk about antediluvian kings. Open up later Egyptian king lists, and you don't just get a neat sequence, Nama, First Dynasty, Second Dynasty, and so on. You get whole ages stacked behind that, receding into a kind of cultivated mist. There's the age when the gods themselves ruled Egypt. Atum, Shu, Geb, Osiris. Then the venerables of the north and venerables of the south. Then a shadowy group called the Shemsu-Hor, usually translated as the followers of Horus. Only after all that does the familiar pharaonic history begin, the one we can actually track in stone and pottery. On paper it looks beautifully organised, almost too organised. The problem is our main sources for this are not early. They're Egyptians looking back across a very long, very complicated history and trying to turn it into a straight line. The most famous is the Turin Royal Canon, a fragile papyrus from the New Kingdom, around the 13th century BCE. It tries to list rulers from the gods down to the king who was reigning when it was written. Large sections are destroyed, but you can still see categories like those who were followers of Horus with improbably long totals of years. Then there's Manetho, an Egyptian priest writing in Greek in the 3rd century BCE under the Ptolemies. We don't have his original work, only later summaries and quotations, but he's the one who divides Egyptian history into the 30 dynasties you see in textbooks. Before his first dynasty, he also puts divine and semi-divine rulers whose reigns stretch back tens of thousands of years. Earlier temple inscriptions and tomb texts sometimes mention the Shemsu-Hor too, but usually in passing, as a revered group in the deep past, or as a kind of holy precedent. They're never described in detail the way later kings are. So you have this odd structure, very late documents, supposedly preserving very early memories wrapped in religious language and huge numbers. What do you do with that? One line of interpretation says, the Shemsu-Hor weren't a lost dynasty at all, but an ancestral cult. In this view, followers of Horus might refer to elite lineages in pre-dynastic Upper Egypt, families who claimed Horus as a patron and were later mythologized as a continuous, almost timeless group. When New Kingdom scribes looked back, they telescoped generations of local chieftains, priests, and clan heads into a single mystical category that could sit neatly between the gods and real kings. Another possibility frames the whole thing as priestly chronology. By the New Kingdom and later temple bureaucracies had to make sense of staggering amounts of inherited material. Old king lists, festival records, local traditions, theological schemes, creating a long, ordered list of rulers, starting with gods, moving through semi-divine beings and ending with human kings, was a way to impose structure. The Shemsu-Hor become a convenient bridge class, neither fully divine nor fully historical, plugging holes in the timeline and aligning political history with cosmology. And of course there's politics. If you're a pharaoh whose power depends on being seen as Horus on earth, what better way to legitimize yourself than to claim an unbroken line of Horus followers stretching back into myth? Embedding the Shemsu-Hor in official lists turns a regional god's cult and its early elites into the backbone of all Egyptian kingship. It's nation-building written in divine time. None of this means there was no real complexity in Egypt before the First Dynasty. Quite the opposite. Archaeology in Upper Egypt, especially around Nakada, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos, shows a long process of increasing hierarchy and state formation before Narmer ever swings his ceremonial mace. In the Nakada culture, over roughly 1,000 years, graves become more differentiated. Some individuals get bigger tombs, finer goods, imported objects. Settlements grow. You start to see fortified sites, large ceremonial centres and iconography that looks suspiciously like early kingship. Men wearing tall crowns dominating prisoners, boats in formal processions. At Hierakonpolis, there's a large elite cemetery and a monumental ceremonial precinct, centuries before the First Dynasty. At Abydos, the royal cemetery of the earliest dynasties sits right next to earlier, impressive tombs that already look like the resting places of big man rulers. In other words, there were powerful chiefs and proto-kings in Upper Egypt, probably organizing warfare, trade, and ritual on a regional scale, long before anyone carved a name that we can confidently read as Narmer. If you squint, you can see how, centuries later, those dimly remembered elites might get swallowed into a single mythic category, the followers of Horus, rulers before history. But the match is never clean. The archaeological record shows overlapping polities, rival centres, gradual consolidation. It's messy. There is no clear line where divine rule ends and human rule begins. No neat roster of pre-dynastic kings that lines up with the Shemsu-Hor entries in the Turin Papyrus. What archaeology gives us is broken ceramics, grave goods, settlement plans, radiocarbon dates. Enough to say, there were complex societies here, with hierarchies and long traditions before the official starting gun of Dynasty 1. Not enough to tie those directly to the named groups in late religious lists. And Egypt's famous continuity makes this more confusing, not less. Because Egyptian culture stays recognizably itself for 3,000 years, it's tempting to imagine the centuries before Narmer as just more Egypt stretching backward, ruled by conveniently labelled categories, gods, venerables, followers. A single unbroken line. But continuity can create an illusion of order. Later priests projected their own tidy sense of cosmic history onto a much rougher, more fragmented past. They backfilled the before time with structured lists, divine genealogies, and impossible reign lengths. Mesopotamian and Egyptian deep time traditions rhyme in interesting ways. Both talk about ages before the familiar dynasties. Both inflate years to fantastic scales. Both anchor present authority in some remote sacred antiquity. Yet they differ in emphasis. Mesopotamian texts foreground primeval cities and antediluvian kings tied to specific urban centres. Egyptian traditions foreground divine and semi-divine rulers tied to a cosmic kingship that eventually coalesces around the Nile Valley state. In Sumer, the mystery clings to place. Where exactly was that earliest Eridu, that first Sippar? In Egypt, the mystery clings to persons and titles. Who, if anyone, were the Shemsu-Hor in human terms? In both cases, the record gives us tantalizing overlaps between myth and dirt. Enough to sense that real, complex societies lie behind the stories. Not enough to just point to a mound or a tomb and say, there, that's the missing civilization the oldest writers were talking about. Which raises a bigger question. When myths speak of a first time or a race of divine followers, are they remembering someone else entirely? Or are they remembering an earlier version of themselves? In Egypt, that earlier version of themselves has a name. Zep Tepi, usually translated as the first time, it shows up in temple inscriptions and religious texts as a kind of sacred origin point. Not a date you could circle on a calendar, but a when everything began moment. When the gods raised the primeval mound out of the waters of chaos, established Mart, cosmic order, and set kingship in motion. In later Egyptian theology, almost everything important is said to go back to Zep Tepi. The first temple? It was really a copy of the one founded in the first time. The correct way to perform a ritual? It's the way it was done in the first time. The legitimate king. He rules because his office descends, unbroken in theory, from the pattern created in the first time. If you read this with a modern literalist eye, it's easy to hear Zep Tepi as a lost epoch, a real earlier civilization where gods or godlike beings walked around, built architecture, laid down science and law, and then vanished, leaving the historical Egyptians as mere heirs. Swap gods for advanced visitors, and you've basically written half the internet. But in Egyptian thought, Zep Tepi is less like a missing chapter of history, and more like the template version of reality. It's the cosmic beta release where everything gets set up the way it's supposed to work, so that later priests, kings, and towns can say, we're legitimate, because we're aligned with that primordial pattern. This is where temple theology becomes crucial. From the Old Kingdom onward, and especially in the great New Kingdom temples, Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, priests are constantly doing a kind of retroactive projection. They take the rituals they perform in their own day, the layout of their own sanctuaries, the status of their own god, and they push all of that backwards into Zep Tepi. So an inscription might say, in the first time, when Amun first appeared, he established his temple here, he decreed its boundaries, he gave its priests their roles. That sounds like a report from a distant age, but it's really a theological claim wrapped in narrative form. What we're doing right now in this building is not new. It is rooted in the oldest order of the universe. It's political too. If your temple can claim that its god already ruled in the first time, that its rituals were already being performed back then your contemporary priesthood isn't just a local cult. It's plugged into the very origin of creation. That puts you in a different league when you're negotiating land grants and royal support. This is the same move we saw with the Shemsu-Hor, just operating at a different scale. And again, the problem for us is that texts like this don't stay safely in their original genre. A New Kingdom or later scribe might copy a temple inscription for use in a theological handbook or a priestly manual or a later chronographic work. Over time, the formula in the first time the god did X can harden into long ago before the human kings X happened. By the time Greek and Roman writers are paraphrasing Egyptian traditions, they may not distinguish between mythic first act and remote historical period. They just hear immense antiquity, gods ruling before men, vast spans of years, that gets folded into chronologies like Manetho's, where the divine and semi-divine ages sit in front of the dynasties like actual eras. So you can see the pipeline. Ritual language meant to say this is archetypal, interpreted by later Egyptian scribes as this is very ancient, quoted by Hellenistic writers as this is the beginning of history, read by modern enthusiasts as this is evidence of a missing civilization before Egypt. Meanwhile, on the ground, in the places where these myths are anchored, we can actually dig. At Heliopolis, Memphis, Abydos, Hierakonpolis, we find extremely early cult sites and ritual landscapes. Some go back deep into the Pre-Dynastic, sacred mounds, early shrines, alignments that later temples will build over, enlarge, and reinterpret. At Abydos, for example, later texts say that Osiris's body was buried there from the first time. Archaeology shows a long continuity of burial and cult activity on that ridge, evolving from early elite tombs to full-blown royal necropolis to major Osiris cult center. The dirt is telling us, yes, there are very old sacred foci. Yes, later Egyptians are right that their holy places have deep roots. But when we date the layers, ceramics, radiocarbon, architectural style, we're mostly talking about the 4th millennium BCE and later. Complex, impressive, but still within the envelope of early state formation, not some separate high-tech epoch lost in the Ice Age. That's the distinction a lot of debates skip. A mythic origin narrative says, the world began in a sacred way, our institutions mirror that pattern, our holy places reach back into that charged primordial moment. A claim of a separate advanced civilization would say there was an entire, earlier society materially different from ours, with its own cities, technologies and history, which then vanished, leaving us only memories. Egyptian Zep Tepi material generally looks like the first kind, not the second. But the door isn't fully closed. New discoveries can sharpen or soften this interpretation. If future excavations found, say, organized monumental construction and extensive trade networks around key cult centers significantly earlier than we currently think, pushing big-scale complexity back by many centuries, that would strengthen the idea that memories of very old social experiments were being mythologized into Zep Tepi. On the other hand, if we continue to refine dates and what we keep finding under first-time temples are incremental layers, shrines expanding step by step, no big discontinuities, no vanished level of organization beneath, that would reinforce the view that Zep Tepi is primarily theological, not historical. Either way, the mechanism is the same, and it goes far beyond Egypt. Cultures create first times to give their present order a sacred foundation. Later writers treat those first times as literal epochs. Modern readers go one step further and imagine fully formed, lost civilizations hiding inside the metaphors. Zep Tepi isn't useless data about a missing high-tech culture. It's very useful data about how real early societies remembered and legitimated themselves, and how those memories, stretched over thousands of years, can look like ghosts of someone else entirely. The moment you say a civilization older than ours that we've never found, a lot of people aren't thinking of Zep Tepi or Antediluvian kings. They're thinking of Atlantis. And unlike the Egyptian material, which we piece together from temple walls and king lists, Atlantis arrives in our lap as a single, very specific story in a very specific place. 2 dialogues written by Plato in the 4th century BCE, the Timaeus and the Critias. In Plato's telling, Atlantis is not his own discovery. He frames it as a very old foreign memory. An Athenian statesman, Solon, travels to Egypt 2 centuries earlier. While visiting the priests at Sais in the Nile Delta, he hears them say, in effect, You Greeks are children. You remember one flood, we remember many. Your oldest stories are just the latest cycle. Then they supposedly produce an example. They tell Solon about a great island power beyond the Pillars of Heracles that flourished more than 9,000 years before his time. Atlantis, they say, was larger than Libya and Asia combined, a naval empire that ruled islands and coasts across the Western Sea. It grew arrogant, attacked the virtuous, much smaller Athens of that remote age, and was finally punished by the gods. Earthquakes, floods, and a single bad day and night when it sank beneath the sea. Already you can hear the hook we've been tracing all along. An Egyptian priest claims access to records older than Greek memory, and uses that advantage to say, your civilization is not the first. There was an earlier Athens, there was an earlier enemy. There was an earlier catastrophe, and Plato doubles down on the Antiquity. When we translate the numbers that 9,000 years before Solon drops Atlantis somewhere around 9,600 BCE, that's deep. That's end of the last ice age, before any known urban society, before pottery in many regions deep. If we took the number at face value, Atlantis wouldn't just be older than classical Greece or dynastic Egypt. It would be older than Jericho's early town walls, older than Çatalhöyük, older than pretty much all of the things that archaeologists comfortably call cities. So the story gives us exactly what the modern imagination wants: a named place, a clear claim of extreme antiquity, and a punchline that explains why we haven't found it. It sank, but there's a big problem baked into all of this. Plato is not a historian. He's a philosopher using stories as tools, myths, and thought experiments, designed to make points about ethics, politics, and the nature of reality. In other dialogues, he invents places, characters, and scenarios without expecting anyone to go out and dig them up. The myth of the cave, the ring of Gyges, these are not travel reports. In Timaeus and Critias, Atlantis is the negative mirror of Plato's ideal state. Athens in that remote age is portrayed as austere, just philosophically aligned with the good. Atlantis is rich, luxurious, increasingly corrupt, driven by desire and hubris. The war between them is basically a morality play. The virtuous small state stands firm against the bloated empire. The gods destroy the arrogant. That doesn't mean Plato simply made up every detail. He loved reworking older traditions, dressing them in philosophical clothing. But it does mean the agenda is front and centre. He's showing his audience, in narrative form, what happens when a society abandons measure and virtue. This is why literal readings get complicated quickly. On one hand, the story has anchors in real geography and culture. The Pillars of Heracles are the Straits of Gibraltar. Egyptian priests at Sais are plausible cultural brokers. The idea that civilizations rise, fall, and get forgotten in floods and fires fits both Egyptian and Greek ways of thinking about deep time. On the other hand, the numbers, the scale, the perfect moral symmetry, those look stylized. They behave more like symbolic architecture than like a sober chronicle. So where might Plato have been drawing from? Scholars have floated a lot of candidates. Some see echoes of real Bronze Age disasters, the eruption of Thera Santorini around 1600 BCE, which devastated the Minoan world, tsunamis and quakes in the eastern Mediterranean, the Sea Peoples and late Bronze Age collapse. Others point to memories of conflicts between Greek states and powerful seafaring neighbours in the west. Carthage, Etruscans or older, now obscure rivals. There's also a wider Indo-Mediterranean habit of telling stories about arrogant kingdoms wiped out by water. The flood of Deucalion in Greek myth, the Mesopotamian flood in Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, Egyptian tales of the destruction of humanity by the Eye of Ra, all share a pattern: moral decline, divine displeasure, catastrophic reset. Atlantis on this view is a composite, a bundle of war memories, natural disasters, and theological motifs, refined and repackaged by Plato for his own purposes. The Egyptian framing, our records go back 9,000 years, adds prestige and depth, exactly like Zep Tepi and Antediluvian King Lists, even if the actual chronology is elastic. But if it's just allegory, why does the hunt for Atlantis still have such grip? Partly because Plato is unusually specific. He gives measurements for the island and its concentric canals. He describes its mountains, its plain, its metals, its laws. He gives a relative position, beyond the pillars, in front of a true ocean, with other islands and a great opposite continent beyond. That level of detail invites cartography. From antiquity to today, people have tried to pin it down. In Spain, Morocco, the Azores, the Caribbean, the Black Sea, even Antarctica, every proposed site revises the criteria. Maybe island meant peninsula. Maybe beyond the pillars was a misreading. Maybe 9,000 is a scribal error and should be 900. Maybe the whole geography is moved eastward and refers to the Aegean, which is why we've never found it, keeps regenerating instead of being settled. If the location, date and scale can all slide, you can always move Atlantis to the next unexplored shelf, or the next ambiguous ruin. The hypothesis is elastic enough to dodge disproof. So how do you evaluate Atlantis claims without just rolling your eyes at all of them? A good starting point is to separate 3 layers. First, Plato's text itself, what he actually says in Greek, in its philosophical context. Second, plausible real-world inspirations that fit known archaeology and geology. Tsunamis, erupting volcanoes, regional powers that rose and fell. Third, the much stronger claim that there was a highly advanced Ice Age-era civilization, whose material traces are now almost entirely gone, but whose memories somehow survived in Egypt, in a form Plato could record. The first layer is solid, we can read it. The second is where serious debate often lives. Is Atlantis a dramatized Minoan catastrophe, a Western Mediterranean polity, or an amalgam? The third jumps into the space this video is really about. Could there have been an organized, complex society older than any we've identified, lurking behind these stories? And that leads directly to the next, harder question. If some earlier civilization, whether Plato's Atlantis or something like it, really did exist around the end of the Ice Age, where would its remains actually survive? Not in a book, not in a myth, but in sediments and stone and buried coastlines. Because at some point, if there was an older than ours civilization behind all these tales, its story has to leave the realm of philosophy and drop into the dirt, the seabed, and the places we almost never look. If you're looking for a real civilization that feels like it could play the role of Atlantis, the Minoans are almost too perfect. 2,000 years before Plato, there's this island society in the Aegean, centered on Crete. By the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, they have multi-story palaces with plumbing, light wells, and complex drainage. They're painting vivid frescoes of bull leapers, graceful women, and ships sliding over a blue sea. They're trading with Egypt, the Levant, mainland Greece. They write in not 1 but 2 scripts, including Linear A, which we still can't read, to a lot of modern eyes that looks advanced in all the right ways. Sophisticated art, engineering, seafaring, mystery writing system, a palace-centered economy that feels proto-urban but not quite like the later empires. Then, at some point in the late Bronze Age, their world breaks. So when Plato describes a powerful maritime culture that dominates islands, grows wealthy and arrogant, and then gets hammered by earthquakes and floods, you can see why people start squinting at Crete. The favourite hinge for this connection is the eruption of Thera, modern Santorini. Sometime in the 17th or 16th century BCE, a volcano there doesn't just blow, it disassembles itself. This is one of the largest eruptions in humanly relevant history. The island was a ring around a caldera. Afterward, much of it is gone. We're talking columns of ash into the stratosphere, pyroclastic flows, and almost certainly tsunamis radiating through the Aegean. What do we actually know? We know the eruption was huge. Ice cores and tree rings show a major climatic event. We know the city at Akrotiri on Thera was buried in meters of ash, like a Bronze Age Pompeii, preserving murals, furniture footprints, and streets frozen in mid-use. We know the Minoans on Crete were tied intimately to Thera by trade, art, and probably religion. The style at Akrotiri is essentially Minoan. What's debated is timing and impact. Radiocarbon dates suggest a window around the late 1600s BCE. Some archaeological synchronisms with Egypt point a bit later. The exact year is still argued. Likewise, how directly the eruption destroyed Minoan civilization is not a settled question. Ash layers and tsunami deposits exist on some North Cretan sites, but the main palaces on Crete don't seem to vanish overnight. Instead, the picture is messy. At Akrotiri, people appear to have had some warning. We don't find bodies, just abandoned rooms and storage jars. On Crete, major palaces like Knossos, Phaistos, and Mallia show phases of damage and rebuilding. Earthquake destruction horizons stack up over centuries, with repeated reconstruction. Minoan power does decline after the eruption, but it limps, mutates, and gets entangled with rising Mycenaean Greeks, rather than simply falling off a cliff. This is where Plato's timeline runs into trouble. If you shrink 9,000 years into 900, Atlantis slides into the late Bronze Age, and the Thera catastrophe suddenly looks like a candidate, a proud island thalassocracy in the Aegean, hurt by quakes and sea waves, its influence fading as mainland powers rise. That's a recognizable pattern. But Plato places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles, out in the Atlantic, not in the Cyclades. His story frames an assault on a much older Athens, not on Mycenaean Greece. And even if his numbers were warped in transmission, Egyptian to Greek, oral to written, copying and recopying, there's no straightforward path that turns a 17th century BCE Aegean eruption into a 9600 BCE Atlantic cataclysm. Number drift is real. Ancient numerals are prone to miscopying, and 1000 can function as a rhetorical a lot in some traditions. Egyptian regnal tallies, Mesopotamian king lists, even biblical ages sometimes balloon over generations. So a numerical mismatch isn't an automatic deal-breaker. But it also isn't a magic wand. You can't just wave scribal error over every inconvenient digit and declare victory. To argue that Plato's Atlantis really is Minoan Crete, you end up moving almost everything: the geography, the scale, the adversary, and the date. Meanwhile, the archaeology at Akrotiri and on Crete tells its own, very specific story. Akrotiri is an advanced town, paved streets, multiple story houses, elaborate wall paintings, evidence of long-distance trade. It dies instantly in volcanic terms, but its destruction doesn't neatly coincide with the final end of Minoan culture. On Crete, we see continuity after Thera. Administration continues at Knossos, under what looks like increasing mainland Greek influence. Writing persists now in Linear B, which we can read as an early form of Greek. Minoan religious symbols and artistic motifs survive into later Greek culture. In other words, it's not a clean erasure. It's trauma, followed by adaptation, followed by political takeover. A powerful island culture, shaken by nature, then overshadowed by aggressive neighbours. If you were telling the story centuries later, That could certainly compress into they were great seafarers once, and then the earth and sea turned against them. And that's the key point. Major catastrophes don't have to match Plato's every detail to seed wide-ranging legends. A colossal eruption in the Aegean can echo down through generations as tales of darkness in the sky, drowned coasts and cities half-remembered beneath the waves. Combined with memories of wars and invasions, those strands can weave into composite myths of hubristic islands and divine retribution. But a candidate match is not the same thing as evidence. Matching motifs, an island power, a sea disaster, moral decline, divine punishment, puts you in the realm of shared storytelling patterns that appear across many cultures. To go beyond that, you need hard anchors, inscriptions that name a polity with recognizably Atlantean features, local texts that describe an empire beyond the pillars, Egyptian records that mention a great western island lost to quakes and floods, with dates that line up to something in the geological record. We don't have that. What we do have are beautiful Minoan archives that talk about rations, offerings, and palace economies, not continent-sized Atlantic realms. We have Egyptian records that are detailed about Near Eastern neighbours, vague about the Far West. We have a volcanic disaster that lines up with some late Bronze Age turmoil, but not with Plato's extreme antiquity. If some future discovery were to tighten the link, it would look very different from what we have now. Bilingual inscriptions tying an Aegean or Atlantic power to Egyptian chronological claims, seabed deposits under a sunken harbour with writing that parallels Plato's laws and measurements, a clear textual chain showing how Egyptian priests could be summarizing an actual, datable catastrophe rather than composing a moralizing deep-time parable. Until then, using the Minoans and Thera as Atlantis is less about following evidence and more about satisfying a narrative itch. We want a name, a ruin, a smoking gun. But that doesn't mean the Minoans are irrelevant to the bigger question. They show us how a complex maritime civilization can be hit hard by geology and still half survive in myths and memories. They remind us that coastal societies are vulnerable, that seas can suddenly rewrite maps, and that when we dig in the right places, those lost worlds can reappear with stunning clarity. The trick is not to force every known collapse into Plato's mould, but to ask, if there were others older in places we haven't excavated yet, what would their traces actually look like? And where exactly has the ocean had the most time and opportunity to hide them? If you zoom the lens out from the Aegean, the Minoans and Thera are just one chapter in a much bigger story, the end of the last ice age, and what rising seas do to human memory. Between roughly 20,000 years ago and about 6,000 years ago, global sea level rose on the order of 120 metres, not in a single jump, not as a Hollywood wall of water, but in pulses, centuries of relative calm interrupted by meltwater surges, collapsing ice sheets, coastlines redrawn again and again. Now put yourself anywhere in that window as a coastal hunter-gatherer or an early farmer. You're living near what is, at that moment, the shoreline. You pick that zone because it's ridiculous not to. Coasts are where productivity stacks. Rivers meet oceans, estuaries churn with nutrients, tidal flats and reefs are biological buffets. You get fish, shellfish, seabirds, migrating mammals, plus fresh water and arable floodplains a short walk inland. On top of that, coasts are highways. Before anyone is paving roads, the easiest way to move bulk goods is to float them. Hugging a shoreline in a simple boat lets you carry stone, obsidian, grain, ceramics, even ideas far more easily than hauling them overland. Navigation is literally written in the horizon. Head toward the headland, follow the current travel, when that bright star rises over that notch. And in many latitudes, coasts are milder than inland. Ocean water buffers temperatures. Sea breezes take the edge off heat. Marine layers take the edge off cold. It's not an accident that so many of the world's biggest pre-modern cities later appear on river deltas and sheltered bays. The same logic would have applied earlier at smaller scales when city meant a cluster of huts and fish racks. So if you imagine the first semi-sedentary camps, the first year-round villages, the first people who are wealthy enough in calories to start building things that outlast them, you don't put them all in harsh inland deserts. You put a lot of them at the edge of land and sea. And then, over a few thousand years, the sea eats the edge. In some places, that meant the shoreline creeping inland meters or tens of meters per human lifetime, enough to notice, enough to scare you if your grandparents swear the water used to be way out there. In other places, when ice-dammed lakes burst or grounded ice shelves collapsed, sea level may have jumped faster on regional scales, turning bays into gulfs, islands into shoals, shoals into nothing. All of that has a very simple archaeological consequence. A huge fraction of early coastal settlement is now underwater. This is what people mean when they talk about the drowned shelf. The continental margins that are today 20, 50, 80 meters deep were once dry land, complete with rivers, lakes, wetlands, and, very likely, human communities. You can actually map some of those old landscapes. Sonar shows paleo river channels snaking across the seafloor. Sediment cores preserve ancient soils, pollen, even peat layers that once formed in coastal marshes. We've already stumbled on some of the places people used to live. Off the coast of India, at sites like the Gulf of Hambat, sonar and dredging have revealed geometric arrangements of stone that some claim are urban ruins, and others interpret as natural formations or much later structures. Off the British coast, divers in the North Sea have recovered Mesolithic tools and bones from Doggerland, a now submerged plain that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. In the Black Sea, researchers have found drowned shorelines and what look like ancient river valleys, along with a few possible man-made features closer to shore, at modest depths. There are clearer examples. Submerged Neolithic houses off Israel at Atlit, complete with wells and a stone circle. Prehistoric sites off Denmark, where submerged forests and fishing weirs show intensive coastal use. Even portions of ancient harbours and quay walls around the Mediterranean that now lie several meters below modern sea level. What do these tell us? First, that people absolutely were living on coasts that are now underwater, long before historical writing. Second, that those coasts were often energetic, densely used zones, not peripheral. You get fish traps, canoe landings, storage pits, maybe shrines. What they don't show so far is evidence for a globe-spanning, technologically explosive civilization wiped from the record. The underwater sites we can study look like scaled-up versions of what we see on land at the same times. Foragers with boats, early farmers, village-level societies, adapting to a changing shoreline. And there's a reason the sample is so thin. Underwater archaeology is brutally hard. Visibility can be terrible. Currents move you, sediment buries what you're trying to see. Just getting a research vessel, sonar equipment, dive teams or remotely operated vehicles on site costs orders of magnitude more than sending a field school to a hilltop ruin. Legal jurisdictions overlap, national waters, exclusive economic zones, heritage laws, commercial shipping lanes. In some politically tense regions, you simply don't get permission. Preservation is also a double-edged sword. In low oxygen, cold or anoxic environments, wood and organics can survive beautifully. Shipwrecks on some seafloors look almost fresh, but in shallow, warm, high-energy coasts, the exact places early communities likely clustered, waves and storms can shred and scatter buildings. Sand and silt can smother sites, then scour them away centuries later. Metal corrodes, pottery breaks and disperses. A stone foundation might survive, a reed house above it does not. Given those constraints, how do you even look? Marine surveys focus on signatures. You map paleo shorelines, ancient beach berms, river mouths, lagoon edges. Then you scan for anomalies, regular geometric patterns in seafloor topography, right-angled blocks, circular arrangements that don't match natural rock bedding. You drag magnetometers to pick up concentrations of metal in later periods. In earlier ones, you look for napped stone tools in dredge spoils or cores with sudden spikes in charcoal and pollen from cultivated plants. If you find stacked stones where a cliff shouldn't be, or a rock shelter roof with hearth ash below present sea level, that's a clue. If you find a drowned forest and, above it, a layer rich in human artifacts, that marks a timeline. People lived here when this was dry land, and the sea took it afterwards. Could a coastal civilization, one important enough to haunt later myths, end up mostly out there? It's not impossible. Imagine a network of seafaring villages strung along what is now the continental shelf, linked by trade and kinship, sharing a common style of building and belief. As the sea rose, those communities adapted, moved, rebuilt, until a combination of climate stress, resource collapse, and maybe one spectacular regional flood knocked the system into decline. The survivors retreated inland, carrying stories of the lands our grandfathers walked on, now under the sea. Centuries later, those memories harden into tales of an earlier age, when the shore was farther out and people were richer, wiser, closer to the gods. If scribes in Egypt or Mesopotamia heard such stories from coastal neighbours, they might fold them into their own deep-time narratives. A first time when gods walked on now vanished ground. A pre-dynastic era of followers who came before the known kings. A western land that sank. But we have to be careful what we smuggle into that gap. Yes, the underwater archive is real, vast and barely touched. Yes, it is exactly where you'd expect to find a lot of missing pieces about early maritime societies. That makes it a promising frontier for explaining why so many myths remember floods and drowned coasts. It does not automatically validate every story of laser-wielding Atlanteans or Ice Age skyscrapers. When we finally map more of those drowned shelves in detail, the smoking guns we're likely to find are jetties, fish traps, post holes, maybe modest stone platforms and burials, not 100-kilometre gridded super cities. If we're lucky, we might hit genuinely surprising things. Early harbours centuries older than we thought possible, long-distance seafaring predating known records, maybe even regional chiefdoms whose centres are now 20 metres down. Those would still be revolutionary. They would change how we think about when and where complex societies emerged. They could give context to those ancient claims of predecessors, elders, people before the flood. But we should expect continuity, not magic. The ocean isn't hiding an entirely different kind of humanity. It's hiding chapters of our own story that happen to be inconveniently wet. And even if we someday drag pieces of those chapters off the seafloor, a submerged harbour, an inscribed stone naming a coastal polity we've never heard of, that will raise a new question. Were those older ones truly a different civilization, or just an earlier version of us, written on a page we'd forgotten to read? To get closer to that, we need to look not just under the water, but back in time before the classic first cities entirely, into a world where people are building monumental things long before writing. Kings, or even agriculture, look the way we expect. If you rewind the tape even further back before Uruk and Memphis and the harbours that are now underwater, you hit something that doesn't look like a city at all, and yet feels uncomfortably like the beginning of one. On a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, starting around 9600 BCE, people hauled multi-ton T-shaped pillars into circles, carved them with animals, abstract symbols and stylized human arms, then buried the whole thing on purpose. This is Göbekli Tepe. When it was first dated, it scrambled a neat story that archaeologists have been telling themselves for decades. First you get farming, then you get villages, then surplus, then hierarchy, then someone finally has the time and muscle to build temples and palaces. Göbekli Tepe seemed to flip that script. Here were massive stone enclosures 12,000 years old, built by people who, as far as we can tell, were still foragers or at best experimenting with early cultivation. No streets, no storage complexes, no clear residential layers wrapped around the site, just dense clusters of monumental, apparently ritual spaces. And that's where the interpretive fireworks begin. Because if your mental model is complex buildings equal civilization, then finding something like this before the Neolithic farming package is like opening a kid's sketchbook and seeing a photorealistic portrait. It's tempting to say there must have been more. Hidden cities, lost dynasties, an older civilization quietly running the show while everyone else is supposed to be carrying spears and berries. But we have to be precise about what Göbekli Tepe actually is. It's not a city. There's no evidence for a permanent, dense residential population there on the scale of even a modest Bronze Age town. It's also not a literate culture, as far as we know. Those foxes and vultures and strange H-shapes on the pillars are powerful, but they are not, in any deciphered sense, writing. We don't see repetitive sign sequences with clear syntax. We see images and motifs that look like shared symbols, maybe even proto-icons, tied to mythology or clan identity. What we can say with some confidence is that Göbekli Tepe proves a few big things about people right after the Ice Age. First, organised labour. You don't quarry, shape, transport and erect 30-ton stones without planning, leadership, and a way to feed a lot of workers for days or weeks at a time. That doesn't require kings and bureaucrats, but it does require coordination across multiple bands and seasons. Second, shared symbolism. The same basic pillar form repeats. Certain animals and abstract signs show up again and again, in different enclosures and phases. That smells like a common ritual vocabulary, stories and meanings that multiple groups recognized and agreed were worth building in stone. Third, regional networks. The limestone ridge isn't overflowing with everything you'd need. There are hints of materials and practices linking Göbekli Tepe to a wider landscape, with other smaller sites using similar pillars and motifs. That implies gatherings from a catchment area, maybe hundreds of square kilometres wide. Pilgrimage, alliance feasts, seasonal rites, things that pull scattered communities into a larger social field. All of that is complex. It is sophisticated. It tells us that the capacity for large-scale cooperation and symbolic architecture existed earlier than we thought. What it does not automatically tell us is that there was an unknown advanced empire behind the curtain. Monumental is about energy and intention, not necessarily about bureaucratic states, metal technology, or urban grids. You can get impressive stone circles from acephalous societies. You can get breathtaking art from hunter-gatherers. Complexity in ritual and complexity in administration do not have to rise in lockstep. But discoveries like Göbekli Tepe are catnip for older civilization narratives, because they open a real gap between what we used to expect and what's actually in the ground. Into that gap, you can pour almost anything. Forgotten astronomer priests who taught the Sumerians how to count, Ice Age city builders whose knowledge trickled down as myth, a vanished culture that knew the true gods before Zep Tepi or the Antediluvian kings. There's a more grounded way to read it. Imagine you're a priest in Uruk 3,000 or 4,000 years after Göbekli Tepe has been abandoned and eroded. Scattered on distant hills are old, half-buried stone rings and solitary standing pillars, already ancient when your grandfather was born. You don't know who made them. You just know that your own sacred landscape has older scars. It would be easy, maybe irresistible, to fold those into your origin stories. This hill is where the first ones worshipped. These stones were set up by the people before the flood. The gods taught them, they taught us. The real messy timeline of overlapping forager farmers and regional cult sites compresses into a clean mythic sequence. A founding age, a disaster, then you. Later writers inherit those stories. Greek visitors, Egyptian chroniclers, Babylonian scholars, they all see ruins whose builders they can't name and attach them to whoever their culture says came before. Göbekli Tepe shows that this process could reach back astonishingly far. Sacred landscapes can be multi-layered palimpsests, each generation of worshippers and builders overwriting the previous ones, while still sensing that something older is underneath. Future digs on that Anatolian plateau and at related sites may sharpen the picture. We might find more evidence for seasonal habitation, hints of emerging elites, or clear links to later Neolithic villages. We might map a whole constellation of ritual centres, some tiny, some Göbekli scale, showing how ideas and people moved through that region for millennia. If that happens, it won't neatly confirm lost super-civilization theories. It will do something more interesting. It will show how deep the roots of organized ritual, shared symbols, and large-scale cooperation really go, and how easy it would have been, thousands of years later, for the first writers to look back at those ghostly foundations and decide that someone greater, older, almost godlike, must have stood there before them. And that brings us to another piece of the puzzle. What happens when you do have urban scale complexity and even inscriptions, but the script itself is still mute to us? When the script stops being mute, you expect the past to finally start talking. With the Indus Valley civilization, it opens its mouth, and nothing comes out we can understand. 2,000 years after Göbekli Tepe, on the floodplains of the Indus and its tributaries, people built something that absolutely looks like civilization in the classic sense. By around 2600 BCE, they were living in dense, planned cities that could rival early Mesopotamia and Egypt in sheer scale. Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, dozens of other urban sites stretching from what's now Pakistan into western India, gridded streets laid out with eerie regularity, brick houses with internal bathrooms, covered drains running under the roads, linked into an integrated sewage system that still makes modern visitors do a double take. Standardized baked bricks, fired to similar dimensions across hundreds of kilometers. Carefully calibrated stone weights in repeating ratios, used for trade. This is not a scatter of huts around a ritual hill. This is urbanism. This is logistics. We can see that they traded widely. Indus seals and beads show up in Mesopotamian cities. Mesopotamian texts mention a trading partner called Meluha that most scholars think is the Indus region. We find marine shells far inland, lapis and carnelian, that had to move along deliberate routes. Someone was organizing production, moving goods, keeping track, and they were writing, or at least inscribing. Tiny stetite seals, copper tablets, pottery sherds, even tools carry short sequences of abstract signs, comb-like shapes, circles, tridents, fish-like figures, geometric strokes. The same signs recur in consistent combinations and orders across a vast area and for centuries. Everything about this screams script, but no one, so far, can read it. That's the wall we hit with the Indus. We have something close to a modern archaeologist's dream. Big cities, lots of artifacts, clear evidence of craft specialization, standardized measures. We probably have their names for things, their official stamps, maybe even the titles of their elites. But we don't have a Rosetta Stone. No bilingual text saying, this says X in Sumerian and Y in Indus. No long monumental inscriptions that might show internal structure, grammar, or repeated royal formulas. Most Indus inscriptions are just a handful of signs long. They look like labels, ownership marks, ritual tags. So the civilization is loud in bricks and weights and drains, and almost silent in words. That has two big consequences for our older than the first records mystery. First, the Indus itself cannot currently tell us its own deep past. Mesopotamian and Egyptian texts point to antediluvian kings and mythical first times. We can argue about how literal they are, but at least we can read the claims. Indus inscriptions might contain something similar. Origin stories, lists of ancestors, references to earlier peoples, yet right now they're locked away in sequences of fish and tridents we can't pass. Second, when other cultures talk about the Indus, they do it from the outside and often in maddeningly vague ways. Mesopotamian scribes mention Meluha, ships from Meluha, Meluhan interpreters, exotic goods. They don't give us a narrative of Indus history, they give us a trade contact and some prestige imports. This is the nightmare scenario for reconstructing the deep past. A major civilization that almost certainly had its own records and its own memories of who came before, but whose textual voice is effectively erased. You can feel the hole it leaves. We know a lot about the Indus from material culture alone. Their city planning suggests some kind of central coordination, but we don't see giant palaces or kingly statues. Their distribution of wells and uniform house sizes has led some to speculate about a comparatively egalitarian urban order, or at least one where power expressed itself differently than in Egypt's pyramids or Mesopotamia's ziggurats. We see standardized weights and measures implying shared rules about value. We see carefully maintained drainage implying collective investment in public infrastructure. We see craft quarters, bead workshops, shell working floors, industries scaled for export. All of that tells us they were plugged into wider networks. It does not, by itself, prove that they were the mysterious older civilization remembered by Sumerian or Egyptian texts. Chronologically, they're contemporaries. The Indus urban peak overlaps with the Old Kingdom in Egypt, and the early dynastic and Akkadian periods in Mesopotamia. They are one branch of the same Bronze Age explosion, not a shadow empire thousands of years earlier. But here's where decipherment could matter. If someone eventually cracks the Indus script, and that's still a big if, given the short inscriptions and lack of bilinguals, it could redraw the mental map of who knew whom, and when. Those little seal texts might turn out to be pure admin. So and so son of so and so 10 measures of grain. They might be clan emblems or ritual phrases, or tucked among them, we might find the equivalent of personal names, titles, maybe even occasional references to foreign lands or ancestral events. A single sign sequence that clearly maps onto a known Mesopotamian toponym, Uruk, Akkad, Dilmun, would instantly tighten the web of connections. A repeated phrase that looks like after the Great Flood, or in the time before the cities, would light up every debate about civilizational memory. Because that's what counts as evidence for contact or memory across civilizations. Once you strip away the romance, shared loanwords that travel between languages, place names that reappear in different scripts, parallel lists of kings or dynasties where you can align dates, descriptions of foreign customs that match what we see in the ground, mentions of specific trade goods that line up with archaeological finds, material parallels alone. These people also built with bricks, also had drains, aren't enough. Human beings reinvent similar solutions all the time. It's the textual echoes, the named names, that let you say with some confidence, they knew about those people or they preserved a story about something earlier. Right now, the Indus is a neighbour whose house you've walked through 1,000 times, whose tools and furniture you've catalogued, but whose language you don't speak at all. They almost certainly had their own version of deep history. They may have told stories about older rivers, earlier settlements, floods that reset the world. Those stories might connect faintly or strongly to the myths written down later in Sumer in Egypt in the Hebrew Bible, until the day someone can look at an Indus seal and say, "This sequence here, this is a name we recognize," that possibility stays theoretical. And so our search for the older than the first record civilization has to move carefully between two cliffs. On one side, the silence of scripts we can't yet read. On the other, the noise generated when we misread the ones we can. Once you start worrying about misreading, you realize how fragile a lot of amazing claims really are. Because the danger isn't just a lost script like the Indus. It's the scripts we think we understand so well that we stop asking basic questions. A huge chunk of "there was an older civilization before us" comes from simple category errors. Translators turning titles into peoples, gods into kings, metaphors into timestamps. Take something like the followers of Horus in Egypt, or semi-divine sages in Mesopotamia. In the original languages, these can be fluid labels. They might mean a priestly office, a mythic retinue, an ideological slogan, those who walk in the way of Horus, not necessarily a separate ethnic group with its own capital and bureaucracy. But jump forward 3,000 years. A priest or chronicler is copying an older text, smoothing it into the political story of his own time. Followers of Horus gets lined up before the proper dynasties. A later historian reads that as a list of rulers. A modern writer reading a translation that has upgraded servants of Horus to Horus kings decides this must be evidence for an entire forgotten civilization. At each step, a little more concreteness gets added. A phrase that may have started as a theological category ends up on YouTube as proof of a missing empire. The same thing happens with numbers, but worse. Ancient chronologies inflate very easily, and for reasons that made sense to them at the time. First, their number systems don't always map cleanly onto ours. Sumerian and Akkadian use a base 60 system layered with decimal units. Egyptian has separate ways of writing 10 as a simple count and 10 as a formal grouping. If you miss which unit is being used in a given context, your dates can swing wildly. Second, time itself is not always what we think. A year can mean a full solar year, or a single season, or a ritual cycle. Some king lists seem to count reign lengths by festivals, not by birthdays. Others may compress co-regencies or overlapping local rulers into a single linear sequence. Third, and most human, kings lie. If you're a ruler trying to impress your subjects, it is far more dignified to claim that your city has been standing for 36,000 years than for a few centuries. Babylonian scribes routinely massaged figures to give their dynasties glorious antiquity. Hellenistic priests in Egypt projected their temple lineages back through immense cycles, in part to out-ancient their Greek overlords. Antiquity was a political resource. The older your cult, your city, your bloodline, the more legitimate your claim to rule. So lists get padded, cycles get stacked, gods, demigods and humans are all given reign lengths and slotted into neat columns. Literal time and symbolic time mix into a cloudy broth. Modern pseudo-chronologies love that broth. They skim off the most dramatic numbers, 432,000 years for Antediluvian kings, 36,000 years for priestly dynasties, ignore the textual genre, ignore parallel versions that give different totals, and then graft those figures straight onto geological timelines. A single line like before the flood, the kingship descended from heaven and ruled for 241,200 years becomes a headline. Ancient Sumerians, remember civilization, 200,000 years older than we thought. What's missing in that jump is context. Is the text ritual, literary, or administrative? Is the number part of a pattern of sacred math, multiples of 60, multiples of 12, or an attempt at actual historical recording? Do other texts from the same culture use similar figures in obviously symbolic ways? You can watch the same mechanism at work in more recent cases. An inscription that says "in the first time," when the gods ruled alone, is almost certainly mythic framing. Think "in the beginning" or "once upon a time," not GPS coordinates. But if you extract those words, strip away the rest of the sentence, and forget that the entire passage is carved on a temple wall celebrating a particular god's powers, you can sell it as ancient testimony that non-human rulers governed Earth before recorded history. Over and over, a single ambiguous phrase gets isolated, enlarged, and then treated as if it were a straightforward chronicle entry. Scholars try to prevent that by throwing a whole toolkit at these texts. Philology, paying obsessive attention to how words and phrases are used across hundreds of documents, not just one exciting quote. If "followers of Horus" shows up next to terms for temple personnel in most contexts, that weighs heavily against reading it as a lost ethnic group. Comparative texts, lining up different versions of the same list or myth. If 3 king lists give wildly different reign lengths, but all agree on the sequence of names, that tells you something about what was flexible and what wasn't. Stratigraphy and archaeology, checking whether the supposed chronology matches what's in the ground. If a king is said to have reigned 10,000 years before a certain temple, but the temple sits directly on top of layers that can be radiocarbon dated much later, you have to decide which kind of evidence is more likely to be distorted. Context asking, who wrote this, for whom and why? A hymn that praises a god for ruling for millions of years is doing theology, not timekeeping. A dedication that boasts that a city was founded in the days when the sea still covered the plain may be referencing a local flood, not a global cataclysm. You don't need a PhD to start using a lighter version of that toolkit yourself. When you hear a bold claim about ancient texts and lost civilizations, run it through a simple checklist. First, what is the source exactly? Not ancient texts say, but which text in what language, from what time? Second, genre. Is it myth, hymn, king list, legal code, letter, temple inscription? Mythic and ritual texts are allowed to be poetic. Legal contracts usually aren't. Third, consistency. Do other texts from the same culture back up the claim? Or is this a lone outlier? Outliers can be important, but they're also easier to misread. Fourth, numbers. Are the figures neat multiples of sacred numbers like 60, 72, 360, or do they look like messy human scale counts? Perfect roundness is a warning sign. Fifth, dirt. Does the archaeology in that region support anything like the scale or age being claimed? If not, are there good reasons to think the material record is missing? Or is it more likely the text is doing symbolism? If a theory blows past all 5 of those questions with a shrug, it's not solving a mystery, it's feeding on one. Because the possibility of a real earlier us is compelling enough on its own. We don't have to press every god, every number, every metaphor into service as data. But to see where the gaps actually are, we have to be ruthless about where the texts stop being history and start being something else. If we're going to be ruthless, we have to flip the question around. Instead of asking, where is the evidence for this older civilization, we have to ask, given how the planet actually works, how much evidence should we realistically expect to survive at all? This is where archaeology gets very un-Indiana Jones very fast. Because most of the ancient world was not carved in granite and basalt. It was mud brick and timber. Take the cities of southern Mesopotamia, the homeland of all those Antediluvian kings. They were built on flat alluvial plains with almost no good stone. Walls, houses, even some temples were mud brick thrown up on reed foundations, plastered, repainted, repaired, and then, when they crumbled, levelled out and built over again. Leave a mud brick city alone for a couple thousand years, and it doesn't turn into picturesque ruins. It turns into a low, rounded mound that looks like a natural hill. Rain rounds the edges, wind moves dust, farmers plough the top. In cross-section, you might see a beautiful layer cake of walls and floors and courtyards, but on the surface it's just that bump in the field. Wood is even more ruthless. Roof beams, doors, scaffolding, furniture. In most climates, untreated wood rots away within centuries. In the tropics, you can lose almost everything in decades. Microbes, insects, plant roots, all of them are chewing through your evidence long before anyone digs. Taphonomy is the word for this, the study of how things decay, transform, and enter the archaeological record. It's basically the science of why the past is so unfairly sampled. And it's not just nature that censors history. Humans are very good at recycling their own past. We love stone. It's hard to quarry fresh blocks. It is very easy to walk over to the ruins of an older temple, knock out a few columns, and reuse them as foundations for your new palace. The city of Rome is practically a masterclass in this. Medieval and Renaissance builders stripped marble from the Colosseum, the Forum, countless temples burning some in lime kilns to make plaster, slotting other blocks into churches and palazzi. Egypt is the same. Later pharaohs carved their names over earlier cartouches, dismantled obelisks, ripped up older pylons for fill. Every time that happens, a layer of the story gets rewritten in stone. The earlier structure doesn't vanish without a trace, but its visible, legible form does. What's left are oddities in the masonry, reused blocks in strange places, a confusing palimpsest that's hard to untangle unless you already know what you're looking for. Now add climate to the mix. We get an incredibly detailed picture of some ancient worlds, not because they were more complex, but because they got lucky with their environment. The dry sands of Egypt and the Judean desert preserve papyri and leather scrolls that would have dissolved anywhere humid. The reason we can read personal letters from workmen at Deir el-Medina or scrolls from Qumran is not that Egyptians and Judeans were the only people writing. It's that their garbage dumps happened to be in nature's filing cabinet. Move into the humid tropics, the Amazon, much of sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and that filing cabinet has been set on fire repeatedly. Constant rain, acidic soils, aggressive vegetation, ink, paper, textiles, even bone can vanish entirely. What survives best is stone and fired clay. If your complex society preferred wood, wattle and daub and oral tradition, archaeologists centuries later will see you mostly as shadows. This is one reason our global story is so skewed toward deserts and temperate stone builders. It's not that no one else was doing interesting things. It's that the preservation lottery was brutally uneven. Then there's a harder problem. What kind of thing are we even counting as civilization? Archaeology, especially in its early days, focused on big, sedentary urban sites. City walls, monumental architecture, deep stratigraphy. Nomadic and semi-sedentary groups left a different kind of footprint: seasonal camps, light structures, mobile wealth. You can have sophisticated metallurgy, complex trade, layered social hierarchies, and still live in houses that disappear after a few seasons. Pastoralist confederations in Central Asia, steppe polities, desert nomads, riverine fisher traders. Their political and economic complexity is chronically undercounted, because it doesn't look like Uruk in the dirt. So what would missing actually look like when you do regional surveys? It probably would not look like a neat blank labelled "Lost civilization goes here." It would look like gaps and anomalies. a sudden, unexplained jump in technology in one region without obvious local precursors. Exotic materials turning up far from their sources with no known middlemen. Settlement patterns that make sense only if there's a bigger hub somewhere off stage. We sometimes literally find the edges first. Bronze from unknown smelters ending up in tombs, obsidian from distant volcanoes in low-tech villages, standardized weights or seals turning up in places that don't seem to have their own bureaucracies. You get the fingerprints of a network, standardized measures, repeated iconography, consistent alloy recipes, but not the capital that organized the network. That center might be under a modern city, under the sea, or in a taphonomically hostile zone where nothing but scattered potsherds survive. This is where new tools start to bend the odds. LiDAR, laser scanning from the air, can strip away forest canopy and reveal regular patterns on the ground. Hidden causeways, gridded fields, buried platforms. It has redrawn our understanding of Maya lowlands, Angkor's hinterlands, even Iron Age earthworks in Europe. High-resolution satellite imagery lets us spot ancient field systems, road networks, and mound alignments that are invisible from the ground. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry can map walls, ditches, and building outlines without a single shovel going in. Put all of that together and lost starts to mean something narrower. It doesn't mean gone without a trace. It means present as a thin residue folded into landscapes we haven't looked at the right way yet. So, could a whole civilization disappear? In the sense of leaving us nothing like the archives of Nineveh or the temples of Karnak? Yes, very plausibly, especially if it leaned on perishable materials, avoided giant stone monuments, or lived in climates that are hostile to preservation. The more interesting question is whether there are hints of such archaeological dark matter already tugging at our data, pulling trade routes out of line, warping chronologies, leaving technological or genetic echoes that don't quite match the visible players. Because that's where the theories really start multiplying. When you put all of that together, taphonomy, recycling, survey bias, you get a landscape where absence of evidence is ambiguous, and ambiguity is rocket fuel for theories. Most of the arguments cluster into three big families. Think of them as different ways to explain why the very first writers keep hinting at someone older, someone before. The first is the headline grabber, the lost Ice Age civilization. In this view, when Sumerians talk about antediluvian kings or Egyptians talk about a first time, they're dimly remembering an actual complex society that thrived during the last glacial period, long before 10,000 BCE. Proponents imagine something with agriculture or proto-agriculture, large permanent settlements, maybe even metallurgy or advanced astronomy, wiped out by the end of the Ice Age and rising seas. They point to a few things. Sudden appearances of farming in multiple regions with crops that look too domesticated too fast. Megalithic architecture popping up early and in widely separated places. Underwater features on continental shelves that look, from low-res scans, suspiciously regular. They argue if you put an urban coastal civilization on the Ice Age shorelines, most of its major sites are now under 50 to 100 meters of water, in exactly the zone we've barely served. The objections are not trivial. So far, nothing we've pulled up from those submerged landscapes. Cores, dredged material, sonar, looks like city rubble from 20,000 years ago. Paleogenetics shows strong continuity between late Pleistocene hunter-gatherers and early Holocene farmers. There's no obvious intrusion of a ghost population with radically different ancestry. And the technological record, especially in stone tools, looks more like a staircase than a broken escalator. Lots of small cumulative tweaks, not a fall from some vanished high-tech peak. Still, as long as the old shorelines remain largely unmapped, the Ice Age Civ idea stays in the conversation. It predicts we should eventually find big, dense, stratified sites on now submerged continental shelves. Thick cultural layers, clear evidence of architecture, maybe even early writing or at least tokens and standardized measures. It also predicts anomalously early domesticated plants or animals associated with those coastal zones. Those are testable, with systematic seabed mapping, underwater excavation, and better dating of floodplain and delta sediments. The second family of ideas is more modest, but arguably more compatible with what we already know, the maritime network hypothesis. Here, the claim isn't that there was a single Ice Age supercity, but that there were coastal and riverine cultures with surprisingly advanced seafaring and trade, operating as thin, flexible networks rather than giant stone-building states. Think of something like the later Phoenicians or Austronesian voyagers, but earlier and less materially heavy. If that's right, the oldest civilization in myths might be a remembered web of ports, seasonal hubs and maritime specialists who connected otherwise isolated communities. Their capital might never have been more than a large harbour town with wooden warehouses and shipyards. This kind of system leaves a frustratingly light archaeological footprint. Perishable boats, wooden wharves, small, periodically abandoned beach settlements. The strongest traces might be in what they moved: obsidian, shells, metals, distinctive pottery, crops. You'd expect to see exotic coastal materials deep inland, old trade routes hugging shorelines, clusters of similar iconography or measurement systems along separated coasts. Some of that we do see. The problem is disentangling a relatively ordinary, slowly developing maritime tradition from a truly ancient organized network worthy of being mythologized as a prior age. Here, current methods help. Isotopic analysis can track where metals and stones came from. Ancient DNA can follow the movement of people and domestic species, and bathymetric LiDAR can pick out drowned terraces, fish traps, and harbours. If a forgotten seafaring web existed, we should be able to map its routes and nodes, even if we never find a single intact ship. The third camp goes in almost the opposite direction, the mythic ancestor hypothesis. According to this view, when early literate societies talk about rulers before the flood, or followers of Horus, they're not describing a lost polity at all. They're encoding social facts, people who lived before us, those whose customs we imitate, lineages we want to claim. In this reading, impossibly long reigns and semi-divine kings are not corrupted history, but deliberate myth. They legitimize current elites by projecting their authority backward into a sacred, unmeasurable past. The older civilization is your own ancestors, reframed as giants. Or its neighbouring groups you absorbed, rewritten as a previous dispensation. If that's true, what should we find? Not a hidden city, but continuity. Gradual development of settlement patterns, technology and ritual, with no hard archaeological break where a prior civilization drops out. We'd expect myths of golden ages and great floods to be widespread and variable, tailored to each culture's politics, rather than matching a single historical event. That prediction, so far, fits much of what we see. Many flood stories, many first kings, and no single obvious smoking gun site. But reality may not pick one theory cleanly. There's a hybrid possibility that many scholars quietly find plausible, relatively small, real communities or regional traditions that later get mythologized beyond recognition. Maybe a cluster of unusually prosperous late Neolithic towns in southern Mesopotamia really did pioneer irrigation and bureaucracy. Centuries later, their memory inflates into antediluvian dynasties ruling for tens of thousands of years. Maybe an early Nile Delta chiefdom with distinctive iconography becomes, in retroactive royal lists, the followers of Horus governing for centuries before the first pharaoh. Maybe a particularly capable seafaring culture, connecting islands and coasts, ends up as the template for Atlantis. If that's the case, the predictions are subtler. You're looking for pockets where complexity seems to arrive early and intensely. Proto-urban sites ahead of their neighbours, unusually standardized artifacts, sudden jumps in social stratification. You'd also expect later texts and myths in those regions to keep circling back to that same landscape as the place where it all began. Those are things we can test now. High-resolution regional surveys can flag early outlier sites. Fine-grained radiocarbon dating can tell whether a supposed Golden Age cluster actually predates its neighbours. Textual analysis can trace how myths evolve over time, showing whether they drift away from any plausible historical core or stay oddly fixated on real, mappable places. None of these frameworks has sealed the deal yet. Each explains some pieces and struggles with others. But they give us concrete expectations, and that's the key. Because the moment you have predictions, you can stop arguing in the abstract and start asking a sharper question. What exactly would it take to move any of these from speculation to evidence? To move from interesting story to we have to rewrite the timeline? The bar is actually pretty clear. Archaeologists already know what real complexity looks like when they dig it up. It has a pattern. First, you need cities. Not just one weird mound, but a datable urban layer. That means a dense cluster of structures with different functions. Storage, habitation, ritual, maybe production, stacked over time, so you can see growth, rebuilding, sometimes destruction. It means streets, or at least repeated pathways, waste pits, maybe fortifications. It means enough material that you can say people lived here in large numbers for generations. Second, you need a clock, ideally several. If someone wants to claim, this is the civilization the Sumerians were talking about, that layer has to sit firmly in time. You'd want radiocarbon dates from short-lived organic remains like seeds or twigs embedded in floors or hearths. You'd want, where possible, dendrochronology, tree ring sequences that can be cross-matched to existing master chronologies. In some regions you can add OSL dating, which tells you when sediments or ceramics were last exposed to light. When all three line up within a narrow band, your timeline stops being negotiable. Third, you need administration. Real states leave bureaucratic fingerprints. Not just pretty objects, but systems. Clay tablets or tablets' ancestors, tokens, bullae, sealings, standardized weights. Repeated signs scratched into pots or tags that show up in consistent sequences, even if we can't read them. They behave like writing or proto-writing. Seal impressions that repeat across different buildings, suggesting officials, offices, or institutions. A convincing older civilization would come with these administrative tools, not in isolation, but embedded in daily life, on storeroom doors, on jars, on shipments. Fourth, material culture that hangs together. You can always find a weird pot or one imported necklace. That doesn't prove a civilization. What you're looking for is a consistent toolkit spread across multiple sites that all date to the same period. Same building styles, same way of shaping and firing ceramics. Same weapon forms, ornaments, religious paraphernalia. A recognizable style that persists over centuries, evolves slowly, and can be tracked from a core region out toward its periphery. When archaeologists talk about Uruk culture or Old Kingdom Egypt, that's what they're describing. An antediluvian civilization that shows up only as a single isolated site with no clear relatives. Interesting, but not decisive. Then there's the dream find, a smoking gun text. In its strongest form, that would be an inscription on stone or durable clay that does four things at once. It is clearly contemporary with the layer it sits in, not a later copy. You can date the context it came from, not just the style of the script. It identifies a polity or people, city of X, king of Y, people of Z. It locates itself in recognizable geography, rivers, mountains, neighboring groups that can be matched to real landscapes, not just cosmic directions. And it mentions or is mentioned by other texts we already know in a way that lines up. For example, if you found a coastal city with its own inscriptions talking about trade with early dynastic Egypt, and then in Egypt you find a scribal note from the same century listing that city by name along with recognizable goods, and the dates, styles and trade goods all check out. At that point you don't have a rumour, you have a relationship. So where do you actually look for this? The highest probability zones are exactly the places our modern infrastructure and research habits keep ignoring. Paleo coasts, the shorelines that existed 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 years ago, now drowned under 20 to 100 meters of water. Continental shelves off India, the Arabian Peninsula, Southeast Asia, the Mediterranean. These were prime real estate when sea levels were lower, flat, fertile, with easy access to marine resources and river mouths. River deltas, Nile, Tigris-Euphrates, Indus, Yellow River, Mekong. Deltas are productive but unstable. Over millennia they migrate, subside, get buried under meters of sediment. That sediment protects whatever's underneath, but makes it hard to find. Deep coring, seismic imaging, and targeted excavation in ancient buried channels can reveal old occupation surfaces nobody knew were there. Submerged shelves and straits, places like the Sunda Shelf between Southeast Asia's islands, the exposed land that once filled much of the Persian Gulf, the Black Sea shelves, even the southern North Sea Doggerland. We already know people lived on some of these lands. The question is whether any of them reached genuine urban complexity. And then the rebuilt holy cities, places like Eridu, Uruk, Hierakonpolis, Abydos, Byblos, Jerusalem, Varanasi, cities that were sacred for millennia and rebuilt on the same footprint again and again. Their deepest layers are incredibly hard to reach, but if there was a prior complex society in that region, its last echoes might be crushed under later foundations. Micro-excavations in corners, wells, and abandoned sectors sometimes punch through to much older strata. Dating techniques are what keep all of this honest. Radiocarbon measures the decay of carbon-14 in organic remains. It's not perfect, it needs calibration curves, and it has plateaus where dates blur. But if dozens of samples from multiple sites, all associated with the same style of pottery and architecture, keep clustering around, say, 7,000, 6,500 BCE, it's hard to pretend they secretly belong to 20,000 BCE. OSL, optically stimulated luminescence, tells you when quartz grains in sediments were last exposed to sunlight. If a buried harbour wall is packed with sand that was zeroed 8,000 years ago, you're not dealing with an Ice Age port. Dendrochronology chains tree ring patterns from living trees back through ancient timbers. In places with long sequences, it can date wooden beams to the exact year they were cut. Tie that to an inscription naming a ruler, and your historical chronology suddenly has a fixed point you can't slide around to fit your favourite myth. The real power, though, comes when multiple lines of evidence converge. Geology tells you when a coastline flooded, when a delta shifted, when a tsunami hit. Archaeology tells you who was living there and what they were building. Linguistics traces how words for boats, crops, metals, gods spread along those coasts. Genetics follows the movements of people and their animals, showing pulses of migration or admixture that match those shifts. When all four stories line up, you're not just guessing. This is also how you keep sensational claims from turning into either dogma or punchlines. If someone says, "We found a 12,000-year-old harbour town that inspired Atlantis," the right response isn't to scoff or to instantly believe it. It's to ask, where are the samples? What's the dating method? Does the material culture fit that age, or is it clearly Bronze Age? Does the geology say that spot was even dry land at that time? Can other teams reproduce the findings? Extraordinary claims don't need to be protected from scrutiny, they need to be immersed in it. The more rigour you throw at a real discovery, the better it looks. The more rigour you throw at a mirage, the faster it evaporates. If you're the kind of person who actually enjoys that process, watching big mysteries get sharpened by hard evidence, there's a deeper dive waiting. We've put together a book on 12 of the most stubborn, unexplained patterns in ancient history, from odd genetic signals to anomalous ruins, and how researchers are testing them right now. You can grab it on our website, the link's in the description, and there's a discount running this week if you want to support more of this kind of long-form investigation. Because ultimately this isn't just a spectator sport. Viewers really can tilt the odds of finding something game-changing, supporting systematic seabed mapping projects, not just one-off dives. Funding regional survey work in deltas and forgotten hinterlands. Backing open access databases so that when someone in one field notices a pattern, someone in a completely different field can actually check it. Even just refusing to share unvetted ancient city clickbait and instead boosting projects and researchers who publish their data, the older civilizations sitting behind our earliest texts might turn out to be a real but modest cluster of early towns, not a marble and crystal supercity. Or it might dissolve entirely into the slow, messy continuity of human culture. Either way, there's one thing we can already say with confidence. The mystery that pushed scribes in Sumer and priests in Egypt to talk about ages before their own hasn't vanished. It's just moved. It now lives in a different question. What does it mean that even with all our methods and all our data, we still feel like something in the deep past doesn't quite add up? So where does that leave us? We've walked through Sumerian kings ruling for impossible thousands of years, Egypt's shadowy followers of Horus, Plato's story of a civilization already ancient to the Egyptians, drowned coastlines that really did vanish under rising seas, and stone circles and temple, like sites that seem to arrive before the textbook dates for real civilization. Taken together, the strongest older-than-us references look less like postcards from a lost superculture and more like three overlapping things. First, real memories of earlier phases of our own societies, pre-dynastic elites, pre-urban chiefs, pre-flood towns drowned when rivers or seas suddenly moved. Second, mythic inflation. Kings' reigns stretched from decades to millennia. Local floods turned into world-ending cataclysms. Regional powers upgraded into globe-spanning empires. And third, genuine gaps. Places where the archaeology isn't good enough yet to confirm or deny what the texts hint at. Buried deltas, drowned shelves, deepest city layers we haven't reached. An honest stance has to live in that tension. The traditions are intriguing. Some of them map eerily well onto climate events and known migrations. But there are also huge holes, missing links, dead ends. A story in a clay tablet or on a temple wall is a lead, not a verdict. The key insight is this: myths absolutely can preserve memory. But memory becomes history only when independent lines of evidence converge. Text, layer, date, landscape genetics, language, all pointing to the same thing. So try one last thought experiment. Imagine there really was a civilization older than any we've found. Not gods with laser beams, just humans a few thousand years ahead of their neighbours. What would actually survive? Maybe not skyscrapers or perfect harbours, but you'd expect telltale signatures, a cluster of unusually large planned settlements, long-distance trade in bulk goods, standardized weights and measures, distinctive metallurgical or ceramic styles, and somewhere durable marks of administration, tokens, seals, early writing that recur across sites and centuries. If, as we push into drowned coastlines and buried river plains, those patterns start to appear in layers centuries or millennia earlier than our current firsts, we'll have to move the goalposts. If they don't, then the older civilization in our texts will keep shrinking into the messy prehistory of the people we already know. Either way, the mystery isn't wasted. It keeps us looking in places we'd otherwise ignore. If you've stayed with this all the way through, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. So take a second to like the video, subscribe, and hit the notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. Drop a comment telling us where you're listening from. It's always wild seeing this conversation stretch across the map, and tell us what you think the scribes were really remembering. And if you want to go further, that book I mentioned on the 12 prehistoric secrets, from odd DNA traces to unexplained construction booms, is up on our website now. You can read more about it or grab a copy using the link in the description. It's one of the best ways to help us keep making long-form investigations like this. I'll leave you with this. Suppose 50 years from now a discovery forces us to admit that there really was a forgotten, organized society behind at least one of these ancient stories. What do you think that civilization would look like at ground level, and which single piece of evidence, if it turned up tomorrow, would finally make you say, okay, we've been sharing the planet with someone in the dark all along?